the kindness of others. We all depend on it. When we need help, when we need hope, it's the little gestures that mean so much. And the bigger acts that mean everything. Kindness can be a blessing, a balm. Amid chaos and fear, amid isolation, confusion, kindness. Kindness is powerful, merciful, magical. Because we know that sometimes the best medicine isn't medicine at all. We are the people behind the HCA Healthcare Promise. For our patients, for our communities, for each other. You can count on us to show up.
People will always come and go in our lives, but we all know those few who never left because they always leave you with so much more. The ones who make you stronger, build you up when you're broken down. The partners who've always had you covered. At Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Texas, we know what it means to be covered by someone you look up to, even when they're sitting right beside you. To be covered by someone guiding you through more than just the routine. To be covered by that friend you consider the best because that's how they make you feel. At Blue Cross, we know what it means to be there, guiding you toward a healthier state of mind. Because the more we know as individuals, the healthier we all feel as a community. Through it all.
Finish line isn't always a place or something you can see. Sometimes there isn't even a finish line. There's just the race. The race against time, against illness, and the race for answers. There will be difficult days, moments that test your resolve. But other days you win. You beat the odds. You are gloriously triumphant. And the next day, you suit up, you show up, and you begin again.
As the new president of Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Texas, I'm committed to public dialogue and civic engagement. That's what the Texas Tribune is all about. And that's why we sponsor events like the one you're about to see.
Thank you all for being here. It's good to see you. I've missed doing this. This is kind of fun. Nice to be able to look each other in the eye as opposed to just on Zoom. So Representative Rodriguez, you're actually going to do this. You really want to leave the good times and glamour of being in the Democratic minority in the Texas legislature.
The glamour.
Glamour. And high pay. And high pay.
And extremely high pay.
Yeah.
I think my last paycheck, when we're not in session, is about $56. So yeah, I'm going to miss that a lot. But I am going to miss my colleagues. I mean, this delegation, for those of y'all, y'all should know this is the best delegation in the state of Texas. We are like a family, and we get stuff done. And so I'm going to miss that for sure.
Yeah, the family came out to support you. I couldn't help but notice that this morning when you announced in Austin, Representatives Hinojosa and Howard were there to support you.
Yes, and so was Celia Israel.
Representative Goodwin, Celia Israel, Cheryl Cole.
Yeah.
And I want to tie your decision to run for Congress to tonight's event, actually, and ask you first. There's a real possibility that being a member of Congress may ultimately mean more to your constituents than being in a shrinking minority here. When you think about the bills that passed this session, it may end up falling to the U.S. House to get in the water with you and undo some of the products of the 86th Texas legislature. Is that part of the reason that you're going?
Actually, it is. It's part of it. When we broke quorum and went to Washington, D.C. last summer, it was extremely, thank you. You can clap if you want to on that. I mean, that's up to you guys. But, it was a tough, for us, it was about 40 days for us here, being away from our families and our friends and home and everything. And it really was very clear to me that some of the things that we really fight for in the Texas House or in the legislature, really the solutions are there in Washington. And it was really impactful for me. Right. And that had a lot to do with my decision. Yeah.
Now, I want to ask Representative Hinojosa and Representative Howard a version of the same question. Before we actually get into what happened during the 87th in the broadest sense, Representative Hinojosa, you fought hard against the overhaul of election law during this session and were out front among Democrats in Washington on TV a lot, talking about the importance, as you saw it, of trying to hold off the legislature and making those changes. At this point, with the law passed, signed in by the governor, your only hope may be passage of something that would overturn or get in the way of that by Congress. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And so it's essential that our Congress, our Senate, pass one of the several election voter rights bills that's in Congress now. There's now a compromise bill, the Freedom to Vote Act, that Senator Manchin had a hand in. And so time is running out. The Texas voter suppression bill, SB 1, becomes law in December. We did work on, when we were there, we worked on legislation to have look-back clauses or provisions in the legislation to have look-back clauses to give Texas more time. But yeah, that's what needs to happen. They have the power.
Can I point out that we at the Tribune do polling with the University of Texas, and this week had a series of stories out about our poll results, Representative Hinojosa, that showed that of a whole bunch of issues considered by the legislature, actually the state seemed to be with the Republicans who passed that bill. That was 43 for, 38 against in our poll. This very specific bill that you referred to as voter suppression, state doesn't seem to see it that way.
Well, then I think that we need to do better about communicating what's in those bills. And actually, what was ultimately passed was not as bad as what we originally killed because we broke quorum, right? We killed two provisions that were really so egregious that Republicans wouldn't even own them. And one was making it easier to overturn the will of the voters in the courts, not having to prove that fraud resulted in a different result. That was a provision that was in the original bill that once we shined a light on it, Republicans backed away from it. And then there was another one that would do away with Sunday morning voting, which we know was a target on African-American churches that have this long tradition of doing souls to the polls and organizing their communities to go to the polls after church. So it was not, so we made the bill better, right? Still a bad bill, but we do, I think, it probably depends on how those questions were asked. But ultimately, look, I had a meeting of precinct chairs last weekend, and the first question I got when we talked about registering voters was, what can I do that's not against the law? People are scared, and it's going to keep people from participating in our democratic process, and that's a problem.
Yeah. Representative Howard, similar question to you about Congress. You have been out front for many years as an advocate for reproductive rights. This was a session, of course, that saw a ban on abortion at 6 weeks. We have had a nationwide conversation about Roe versus Wade. Again, I think if you look at the polling on this issue, it's pretty much divided depending upon, whether you're asking about the ban or asking about the provision that would allow somebody to sue somebody else. Again, at this point, given the fact that this is now the law of Texas, it's still in the courts, and given the makeup of the Supreme Court, Congress may be the best hope of people who, as you do, view reproductive rights as a battlefront, right?
Well, it does appear that we're having to turn to Congress to actually codify our constitutional rights. Every time I seem to turn around and looking at the Texas Tribune and other media sources, I'm seeing that we're before the Supreme Court on one thing or another. Yeah. Digital billboards. Whether or not when we're killing people with capital punishment, how much spiritual advisement we're going to allow them to have as we're killing them. But yeah, certainly with reproductive rights, I realize the polls, I think to Gina's point, Part of it has to do with us making sure that we're connecting the dots and making sure people understand what's actually at stake here. And with the SB 8, we're talking about a de facto ban on abortion because it's before many people even know that they are pregnant, that we are now saying it's illegal. And this is while the entire rest of the United States has protection for that constitutional right via Roe v. Wade. Texans are not being afforded the protection of that constitutional right. It is absolutely astounding what's going on.
I mean, Representative Rodriguez, cover your ears. I mean, I don't know that anybody who is expecting Congress to solve any problems at the moment is anything more than an eternal optimist. You know, Congress doesn't appear to be able to find its ass with a map and a flashlight at the moment.
Yeah, I didn't cover my ears, but I kind of agree with you actually on that. You know, I was about to riff on what Donna said. I think it's really not Congress; it's going to be the voters.
Right.
I think, you know, if say the Supreme Court does what they may very well do and uphold the law, then it's going to be the voters of all the country that are going to elect Democratic Congresspeople. That then the law will change. I mean, I think Republicans have overplayed their hand on this very important issue. I think Republican women in suburbs it's going to backfire on that. That's going to backfire. I think they're going to go vote for Democrats at that point. That's my belief.
Yeah.
And so, you know, these actions have consequences, but I'll be the first one to tell you, you know, Congress is not necessarily the answer. I'm going to rely on the voters on this particular issue to make the changes necessary so that the makeup of Congress looks different.
And you'll have to see what happens in the election. In any case, test the theory that voters will respond to the way that you're talking about. So, Representative Hinojosa, let's go back to the beginning. Back before 1 regular and 3 special sessions. I can hardly remember what it was like in January before you all gavelled in. Seems like a long time ago. You'd come out of the November elections no better than you'd gone in. Speaking of optimism of Democrats notwithstanding. Republicans were still in charge of the House, had a healthy majority of 9 at that time. Conservative Republican as your new speaker. Dan Patrick still Dan Patrick in the Senate. In terms of how you think Austin and Texas were impacted by this legislature, did you really think honestly back then that it would be any different than it turned out?
I did.
Why?
We elected a new speaker, a speaker who was known before he became speaker to be his own man, to not fall in with the far right on various issues. And that was something that was considered when that race for speaker was had. This has been by far the most radical right legislative session that I have experienced. I've experienced 3 now under 3 different speakers. And, you know, they always go for one major red meat primary voter, Republican primary voter issue at least. But they went for all of them. And they went to the extreme on every single issue. And nowhere did I think they would take abortion rights, they would go to total permitless carry, which our prior very conservative speaker knew was just off limits because it was bad policy, right? You know, name it, they went to the extreme on it. And so I don't think any of us expected that it would be as bad because it has not been our experience from prior sessions, not this bad.
So am I reducing your answer to it's Dade Phelan's fault? So if anybody is unhappy with the byproducts of this session, see Dade Phelan. He's the one responsible.
Well, he is the gatekeeper to the legislation that makes it to the floor of the Texas House. And I will tell you that many of my Republican colleagues would rather not have voted on these things, but they do not have the courage to stand up to their primary voters. And they're afraid they won't come back and they'll lose in a primary if they don't vote the right way on these issues. But many Republicans also thought that there was just no gatekeeper here. And so we got flooded and overwhelmed with everything.
Representative Howard, the theory of the case is that the speaker is a valve, controls the flow of business. Under Joe Strauss, you had a very different approach on some of these very same issues. Representative Hinojosa makes a good point that there were a number of things that passed this time that either didn't get to the floor or didn't even get a hearing in previous, what seemed to some of us on the outside to be pretty conservative House of Representatives, right? So feeling is the difference. The valve was more of an open door, it sounds like.
I don't know how much feeling was the difference as the Republican makeup of the House was different. I think probably in interviews with you, former Speaker Strauss has said that it was much easier to manage the flow of things on the House floor when we were more evenly divided than when there was a strong Republican majority and he was getting a lot more pressure from those within his own party. And I think that, I have to go back to how we even got to where we got and go back to the 2018 election where we did pick up 12 seats, and it made a difference in how the House functioned, even under a conservative Republican Speaker, Dennis Bonnen. We focused on public education because the electorate made it clear that we don't want to be dealing with those wedge issues. We want you to focus on the things that matter in our day-to-day lives. Well, we all came into this election cycle in 2020 with the expectation that Democrats were going to continue to make gains. And it was not just the Democrats that were looking at that.
No, the Republicans on the very day of the election said they were worried that you all
right.
would come back.
I got called the night of the election from a Republican colleague asking me to consider running for Speaker. That was on the day of the election. Then we get here, and because everybody had such tough campaigns with these high expectations that did not happen, they came back with a vengeance. And rather than letting us focus on the things that really mattered, it just was like a full force sower winner kind of experience of let's put everything out there, as Gina said. That's the red meat issue, one thing after another. It was relentless.
Representative, yes, please.
I mean, I think, Donna, that's exactly what I was going to say. I think it's a combination of things. I mean, we did pick up 12 seats at one point. The expectation was we were going to pick up more. Even the Republicans thought so. And frankly, we were actively running against incumbent Republicans.
Yeah.
And so when that didn't happen, now, there was a lot of states that lost seats in the legislature in their states, and we didn't. So that's something we should recognize, that we actually kept our 12 gains that we made in 18. But it really was that they felt like we came after them. We maintained our majority, and now we're going to just teach you all a lesson. I mean, that's the way I interpret it. And I've been through three different speakers, I guess. No, four different.
Well, you
speakers.
were elected
Four.
in
four.
02.
So Craddock,
you came
Craddock
in when Tom Craddock became.
So, and there's, they're all a little bit different, but I mean, Dennis Bonnen, that's not minced. Dennis Bonnen's a very conservative guy, and I'm with Gina. Dade, I was friendly with Dade. I've known Dade, since he's been in. I considered him to be I thought he was less of a conservative member than Dennis Bonnen.
Right, but the difference, as you know, representatives, all of you, because you've said a version of this, is in 2018, you had a great election cycle, and you put the fear of God into the Republicans in 2019, and then effectively, as a party, you face-planted in 2020, and now they didn't fear you. And so they could come back in this election cycle, and they could go for broke.
And they also knew they were going to control redistricting, and
Correct.
so they did not fear the voters.
Right.
They did not fear repercussions for their actions.
So let me ask you about redistricting. I mean, this is obviously a session in which every 10 years we have to redraw the lines around legislative, congressional map, State Board of Education. We knew that was going to be a big thing during the session. It came at the end of what was a series of big things. So you can kind of sometimes go, okay, the map's fine. But that's pretty significant what just happened, right, Representative Hinojosa? The maps were drawn in a way, they're kind of always drawn to keep the party in power. Democrats did it when they ran the legislature. Republicans did it now. But still, it looks like they kind of went for broke on the maps, too, and got pretty much what they came for.
Yes, I will say that was a different brand of Democrats who did that over 20 years ago. So to be fair, if we had a chance, I think Donna Howard is the one who filed the independent, nonpartisan redistricting committee bill that I support.
I don't remember Democrats gleefully drawing districts for Republicans, even with different Democrats in charge.
But I'm going to give
Generation,
I need to give
different
a shout out to a Republican, though, former Senator Jeff Wentworth, who, when the Republicans were in the majority, he was pushing for an independent redistricting commission. So it is possible to push for that even when your party is in the majority.
Of course, I'm conscious of the fact, we reported this, others reported this, that the census numbers that ultimately were delivered to the legislature that allowed the drawing of those maps showed that 95% of the population growth over the last 10 years was in communities of color, and yet the maps that were drawn didn't seem to have any acknowledgement of population change.
That's right.
Yeah.
I will say this. They did draw maps to secure their members who were in jeopardy, but they just don't have the numbers anymore. It's harder and harder for them to do. So while they've shored up some of these swing seats by a few percentage points, they are still swing seats. And so maybe they last a cycle or two, but they can't last much longer.
Representative Rodriguez, you're in the legislature long enough to remember the last time there was redistricting that the Republicans in charge of drawing the maps drew the maps in Dallas County in such a way that they kind of outkicked their coverage, right? And in the end, those seats came back, to Representative Hinojosa's point. You may get these seats for a short time, but ultimately they came back, and for, Dallas County reduced to 2 Republicans for a while.
Right, and I think 10 years ago too, there were lawsuits, and I think there was some favorable decisions for us, just a very, very few. But
Right.
we don't have that recourse anymore with this Supreme Court if it goes that far. I mean, we don't have the luxury of having a judicial system that's going to look at redistricting, for example, when you're packing Hispanics and African Americans into districts because
Right.
of a decision that you can do partisan gerrymandering. That's perfectly fine, and without any look at the correlation between your party and your race or ethnicity. And then
Yeah.
obviously, Democrats.
Right.
So that's what they're doing this time. But I'm with Gina. I mean, I really think that the numbers are not in their favor in the near term.
Yeah.
And I think what they did is truly like the last gasp. I know I even said that 10 years ago. You probably check me on that. I did say that, but I just do think you had a lot of retirements. Did you notice that some of the House members that retired towards the end, Republicans, because they had to be gone so that you can save a Republican.
Right. Well, of course, I have a point about Representative Howard, the retirements. We publish every session, at the end of the session, an analysis by Mark Jones of Rice University that shows partisanship during the session, most conservative Republicans to least conservative Republicans in the House and Senate, least liberal to most liberal Democrats. The disappearance of centrism in the Texas legislature, least liberal Republican in the House, Lyle Larson, not running again. Least liberal Republican in the Texas Senate, Kel Seliger, not running again. Least liberal Democrat in the Texas Senate, Eddie Lucio, not running again. Least liberal Democrat in the Texas House, Ryan Guillen, might be a Republican by the time the clock strikes midnight tonight. Who knows? Or might not run again, or might run again. We don't know. But really, since this conversation is about what this means for Austin, Representative Howard, however the maps may have been overall, all of you are pretty solid. Even Representative Goodwin, whose district has been represented by a Republican in our recent lifetimes, that's now a safe seat, the way it's been drawn. Austin finally has a congressional seat contained entirely within this area that will be presumably occupied by Congressman Doggett, right? I mean, that's the thing. So in some ways, wasn't redistricting sort of good for Austin in that respect?
Well, I think that there was a certain effort to contain Austin.
Yes, Representative Rodriguez.
That's a loaded man.
It's a loaded question. It's our event. That's why it's a loaded question, right? Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah, right. Good.
But to what Eddie was talking about a while ago, if you go back to the previous redistricting of 2001,
right,
and then the redistricting with delay in 2003,
yeah,
they tried to get 3 Republican districts out of Travis County, and that was an overreach.
Right.
And to Gina's point about how these things evolve over a couple of election cycles, they then lost all of those seats.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we're the blueberry, right? I mean, yeah,
that was Rick Perry's line was, "We're the blueberry in the tomato soup."
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, the fact is that I think you could draw the lines all kinds of different ways in Travis County, and you're still going to have 6 pretty solid Democratic seats just because of the demographics of our county.
Right.
Not necessarily because of any kind of gerrymandering going on.
Right.
May I add to that?
Please,
So
I wish you would.
I think you're right. I mean, Travis County ended up better in terms of having very solid, 5, I guess, or 6, I guess, Democratic districts. But that is kind of a testament as to how they needed Republicans out of Travis County in order to create a safe Republican district.
In other words, they pulled
somewhere else.
Republicans out of existing districts to put into districts that were less safe. The result is that the Austin districts are more Democratic,
When you're
but
talking
then the
about,
other ones are more
you're talking about
Correct.
congressional seats then.
Well, congressional.
Yes.
Oh, I thought you were
Yes.
talking. Well, I thought you were talking about the state
Well,
house.
I mean, I think you
But-
can kind of cut it
Yeah,
either
either
way.
way.
Cut
But
it either way.
certainly, we still have 5 or 6 congressional districts in Austin and Travis County, depending on how, if you include the
The
Williamson
difference
part
is
of.
just
Yeah.
the difference is just the dog.
Well,
Right.
but that's a big difference, though. I mean,
Yeah.
when you think about it, I mean, I think it's fair to say that the Republicans 10 years ago were trying to do whatever they could to make Austin like have just one district that's Democratic that may be an Austin district. Turns out that that district that Doggett
Yeah.
represented happened to always be a Travis County district. But now they just said, well, screw it. Let's just give Austin their own. Let's just pack all these D's
Yeah.
in one district.
Yeah.
And now there's, that kind of also tells you they needed to get as many R's as possible to help McCall, to help some of the other folks that were in the Travis County.
Can I just add one more thing to that?
Please.
I think, yes, they needed to shore up their people, but I think they also wised up and figured out when you have all these districts cutting up this liberal area, then you have people like Mike Siegel and Julie Oliver hustling to just find every last vote, and it hurts them in their statewide races. It hurts them in other races. So give Austin and give these Democrats something, and then, they don't have to work as hard to pull out all the votes.
Relent.
Right.
Representative Howard, we started out the session thinking that the pandemic would be the big story of the session, and then all of a sudden in the second week of February we have the winter storm. And we have a conversation around weatherization of the power systems in this state. Do we do enough on the grid? There is legitimately sort of 2 conversations that have resulted from this. One in which people say with a straight face, oh, we totally reformed the grid. And one in which people say, we didn't do anything on the grid, and we're absolutely as much at risk heading out of the session as we were. And it may be that some of the infrastructure bill that just passed Congress ultimately comes back and helps us on the side with that. What's your view of what we did? How did we respond? How will Austin either be benefit or not from what you all did on that issue?
Well, I'm biased in terms of being on state affairs and under Chairman Patty, where we were looking at the electric side of the equation as opposed to energy resources under Goldman, which was looking at the gas side. And I would say that part of the equation was not dealt with as much as it should have been. None of it was done to the extent it needed to be done. We still have a lot that needs to be done to look at the market structure, to look at redundancy, to look at reliability versus the cost, capacity, those kinds of things. But the fact is, and I think we all need to say this, every time we talk about this issue, Texans died.
Well, in fact, according to BuzzFeed's analysis of the numbers, which to my mind is the one that looks to be right, 700 people.
Right.
This is the worst natural disaster in
Right.
the history of Texas.
Right.
Right.
And
And
we-
$130
and-
billion cost
Yes.
at a floor, we learned last week.
And we had
Right.
recommendations that could have prevented this back in 2011 that were not enforced. So there is more enforcement behind what got put into place this time, but still not enough, and especially not enough at all in terms of the natural gas side of the equation. And, being new to state affairs and new to this issue, I had to do a deep dive into something that I knew very little about and came out learning a lot more than I ever would have thought I wanted to know about this. And the fact is that they're totally codependent on one another. You cannot have one without the other. And they were pointing fingers at each other, but the bottom line is that we have to have a reliability of the capacity that is available to us, and we did not have that because they were not communicating, they had not weatherized, they had not determined what critical infrastructure was, and we were within 4 minutes of total collapse in this state. It was
We would have been without power for weeks.
Oh, yeah.
For weeks.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Representative Rodriguez, Michael Weber at the University of Texas made an argument at the time that we had the problems with the grid that we need to not have our own grid. I know that Texas's brand is independence. We like to go our own way. But that it was the vulnerability created by being independent of the rest of the country's grid that caused this to be the very near disaster that Representative Howard is talking about. And then, like a week later, no one was talking about us getting off of our own grid again. And I haven't heard anything about that since. So are we just setting ourselves up now after this legislative session for the same thing?
I hope not, but I think that if like what Donna was saying, that there were some recommendations done 10 years ago,
Yeah.
if we had actually done those things, I don't think we may not have been in this situation. I'm not ready to throw away ERCOT just having one grid.
Right.
However, we should have agreements with bordering, including Mexico, bordering capacity so that we can get that in case of an emergency like this.
Right.
I think, and I'm not an expert on this, but I think that there's some restrictions on our ability to do that currently. So I think that if we did the things that we should have done 10 years ago, we would not have been as impacted.
Yeah.
And I don't have a problem with us having our own grid per se. I really don't.
Provided it works.
Provided it works. But there are things that we can do, I think, that we should have done and that we can do to make it work.
So can I just add to that?
Please.
So one way that some Democrats pass legislation is we sneak it into the budget. So we were able to get into the budget a study to be done to ask, I can't remember, I think it was PUC, to look at if we connect to the Eastern grid and the Western grid and the Mexican grid, would that benefit Texas? It could provide not just stability and security, but it also could provide an economic opportunity to export energy from Texas. So that is something that is going to be looked at in this
Professor Weber
interim.
said that he thought one argument for us being connected to the other grids is that we would be protected if we lost power, we could get it from other places, but if they lost power, we could sell it to them. And so there's an economic benefit. Representative Hinojosa, you were the president of the Austin School Board. We mentioned that Representative Howard was on the school board. All of a sudden, everybody hates school boards. What happened? And this is connected, I guess, to the ban on critical race theory being taught in schools, assuming it's actually being taught, or anybody who voted for this ban could define it, which I have a question about. But now we're beating up on school boards for apparently allowing pornography in school libraries. What's going on here? And how should Austin think about this?
So I have a theory. My theory is that school communities are so tight. You go to the same football games, you sit next to each other at your kids' basketball games, Republican, Democrat. We lost that during the pandemic. Everything moved online, and we lost that sense of community in our schools. And that was replaced by trash, like by QAnon stuff and information wars stuff. And so my hope is that this is not a forever thing. When I was on the school board, we fought about how much money was in the bond for somebody's garage or gymnasium. Those were the major fights in the school board.
Right.
So my hope is that now that we start to gather in person, we begin to form that community and that breaks through some of that partisanship. Because I tell you what, and I am a partisan through and through, it is such a shame to see this kind of partisan division on our school boards. It does nothing but hurt our kids. And I just really am hoping it's temporary.
Isn't this, Representative Howard, a concern for some Democrats heading into the next election cycle? You know, we can sit here and talk about Virginia all day. Let's not. But clearly the question of parents and education and school boards and books, that was a conversation in that race. And it looks like Republicans generally, not to paint everybody with the same brush, but there's a settling on something that seems to have worked. So let's do that over and over during the campaign cycle, right?
Well, I agree with you that I think that suburban moms are a real target for any of us when we're looking at elections, and that they make a difference in a lot of our elections. Maybe I just don't want to, but I'm not going to go there yet to think that we're Virginia. We definitely have aspects of that here, but we also have a lot of parents who have been extremely vocal and concerned about the fact that their children have not been protected against COVID, and their resentment about the state getting in the way of the schools protecting their children.
Now, I don't know if you saw just a little while before we came up on stage, there was a decision by courts to say that the state could not ban mask mandates in schools. And so, in fact, as recently as within an hour ago, it now looks like schools will have some authority to do exactly what you just said.
Well, you know, I was talking earlier about the fact that this is really deja vu to a certain extent. Back in the how far back do I go? 1990s. when we were having these culture wars over sexuality education in the schools and the textbooks then. That's when the Texas Freedom Network started, because there was an effort by the religious right to get on the school boards. And that was around the time that I ran. And there was all this effort to censor the books that were being used in schools and to censor the curriculum that was in the schools. Been there, done that. This is not something new. We just recycle through it, it seems to me. So I think it's a little more vociferous now. And I think by virtue of what's been happening in our country with the allowing of the vitriol to rise to the level that it has risen, that it has made it much more grave than it was back in my day. I wasn't worried about going to the grocery store back then and being confronted. Right now, if I was a school board member, I'd be worried about some things with the stories that I've been told.
Right. We're going to go to questions here at the microphone in about 5 minutes. Let me ask Representative Rodriguez, again, you're the longest tenured member of the House on stage. When you think about the budget, legislatures only have really one constitutionally required thing to do, and that's pass a budget in balance. In 2019, before the pandemic, you passed the first $250 billion budget for the state, 2-year budget in the history of Texas. Everybody worried heading into the session that the economy had collapsed, that there'd be a shortfall. You ended up passing a $250 billion budget this time. Is it a good budget for the state? Is it a good budget for Austin when you think about the big areas of spending? Are there things in there that you think people from Austin go, that's actually pretty good?
Well, probably the things that Austinites would think they're pretty good, we don't spend enough money on. And I think healthcare is one of them. I think mental health is another. I mean, we see the rise of homelessness in Austin and everywhere, frankly, not just Austin. There are things that we can do and invest our money in the cities, including Austin. That is mental health. That's drug rehabilitation. It's housing. It's all these things that we can do. So there's money there, and I think the money could be spent better to help communities like Austin deal with the issues that we're dealing with.
Of course, you remember a time when we were woefully underfunding schools, and it may be that you still believe that we're woefully underfunding schools, but because of what happened in 2019, HB 3, it was an $11 billion all-in investment in public education that held largely in this session, right? So they didn't cut back that. That's maybe a good thing.
That's a good thing.
Right?
And I think, but even then, I don't think we have it in a formulaic way where it's always going to, be what we need.
Well, you got to come back every 2 years and do it again, right?
Unless and Donna's more, she's better to answer these questions. I've been able to avoid the Appropriations Committee for the 20 years.
Avoid?
I have not. Well, I should.
You actually said avoid.
I haven't been on that committee in this whole time. But I think there are things that we can do in the formulas that guarantee, because Austin and every major city, the schools are increasingly majority minority kids, majority Hispanic and African American kids, and they have, and low income kids. And so there's a unique set of problems and issues that those students face that is more than just in the classroom. It's also within their family structure. And so, I think that there are things we can do within the school formulas that can address that more long-term and in a more sustainable way that I don't think that we have done very well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the last question I want to ask each of you before we bring the audience in is, why is Austin always, but especially right now, such a target for this legislature and for state leaders? Is this only about Austin hate? Them picking on Austin, making an example of Austin. Austin is the blueberry in the tomato soup. Let's squash that blueberry. And how much of this is Austin poking the bear with a stick, knowingly, creating problems either inadvertently or on purpose? I mean, I do wonder about that. Just an example would be the camping ban and the degree to which Austin made a decision some years ago that resulted in the legislature deciding to get involved. And then you have other cities saying, thanks a lot, Austin, for creating a situation that the state then decided to stick its nose in. Representative Hinojosa, what do you think about that? How much of this is them and how much of this is you?
Well, that's a loaded question.
Yes, I ask loaded questions.
It's their program. It's their program.
Yeah.
Look, I see my job as not passing judgment on what our local government does, but defending
come on. Please pass judgment,
defending
please.
it. But let me say this: there's no question that our city council is bold and unafraid in policy decisions that they make, and to an extent, probably that is more so than previously. And at the same time, the Republican leadership their whole mode of operation is to deflect from real problems to these made-up boogeymans. And Austin has become one of the major made-up boogeymans, right? And so I think it's both.
You think it's both? Representative?
I'd have to say
You're going to say nice words about Greg Kassar now, right?
Right. No, I think it's a little bit of both. I think it is. I think I agree with Gina. But let me just say this too: Austin isn't the only blueberry in the tomato soup. I mean, Dallas County is very Democratic. Harris County,
Houston, right?
Houston, and Fort Worth is getting there. You know, El Paso, San Antonio, even. So I mean, we're not the only blueberry in the soup. We're the bluest berry probably in the soup. But that's
right,
about
but
it.
you would admit that to the degree that state leaders have it in for one place, it seems like Austin is at the top of the list every session.
Yeah, and I understand. I mean, I've been talking about local control now for the last 3 sessions. I mean, I've always kind of agreed with it, and council should do what they think is best, but they shouldn't do what they think is best for their city without understanding that there may be consequences for that. And it's unfortunate that the state right now, the leadership in the state right now, you have to think that way, but you have to think that way. And I don't believe that. I think the council has failed to do that the last several sessions. The second thing I'll say is that. And I don't want to speak for anyone on this panel, but I have had stronger relationships in the past with previous councils than this one. Not meaning personal relationships. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that we would meet more regularly. They would say, we're thinking about doing this.
You'd be coordinated.
We would coordinate on things. And that just hasn't really happened. And even though, I mean, it happened a little bit last session, but it's almost like the deed is done. I mean, now it's kind of like you're going to do this action during session. It's going to screw everything up and for us. And then at some point in time, I have an agenda that I want to achieve for my constituents. Gina does too. Donna does too. My job isn't to stand up at the back mic and defend the city of Austin 24/7 during the legislative session. I have what I want to do for my constituents. And so that sounds kind of, maybe, I don't know how that sounds, but it's just, at some point I can't, we all can't just say we're an arm of the city of Austin when they make a decision to do something. I would hope that the city of this council and future councils will understand the dynamic of the state, understand what's going on, and know that you could be doing something like a camping ordinance, for example, where that was supposed to be localized, and instead now we have a ban in the entire state of Texas. And you can say the same thing about defunding police. That's something that we had to deal with during the legislative session. Now we have a statewide kind of mandate that you cannot defund police. This was not what the intention of the city council was, but I'm not going to say that they shouldn't have thought this thing
But
through.
you believe that if it had not been for Austin, we might not have had that conversation at the state level.
I believe that to be true.
Yeah. Representative Howard, how do you feel about Austin owning some of this itself?
Well, the fact is that state government is housed in Austin. And so you have all of these folks coming here who represent a wide variety of ideologies across the state, and they basically live here for 5 months every other year and then come during the interims as well. And they absolutely, despite what they say, enjoy being in Austin. They like what we have to offer here, but they also like to go back home and bash this liberal bastion
Straw
here.
man.
Yeah. So, part of it is just because that's who we are. We have the seat of state government right here. In terms of our city council, I expect them to represent their constituencies, and they are representing a more liberal viewpoint than the Capitol legislature as a whole. And so they're going to be looking at things differently than state legislators are. And I do think that COVID also got in the way this last time and exacerbated things in a large number of ways that took us to places we never might have gone otherwise. There's so many things going on here, but the bottom line is that, yes, to Eddie's point, we don't want to be at the Capitol 24/7 defending Austin. We're there to work on statewide issues, and unfortunately, because of so many things that happened in Austin, we were constantly at the back mic defending Austin.
Right.
And so it took away from a lot of the other things that we were there to work on.
Makes a lot of sense. All right, well, it's 7:30, and I know we promised you that we would end promptly. I want to thank, first of all, Representatives Howard, Rodriguez, and Hinojosa for being here. Please give them a big hand. It's a very interesting conversation. Thank you. Please give a very big hand to Noah and Josh Litt and everybody at Batch for hosting us tonight. We appreciate it. What a great spot. I hope you'll come back next Wednesday. We'll have Austin Mayor Steve Adler, Travis County Judge Andy Brown talking about local control, as we said. Continue to read up on all these issues and more at texastribune.org. Think about becoming a member at texastribune.org/give. It is so great to be back out in public with all of you again.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We'll see you soon. Appreciate it.
In the race against time, against illness, there will be days that test your resolve. But other days you win. You are gloriously triumphant. And the next day, you show up and you begin again.